Good morning. Welcome to the 19th annual Through a Veteran's Eye celebration, recognizing veterans from all wars and all peacetime. At this time, I'd like to have Larry Peters do an invocation.
Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God. Let us pray. Almighty God, you know every veteran by name. You know their deeds, their hard work, their sacrifice, and their perseverance. You know their needs, material, physical, spiritual, emotional. Thank you, God, for your unconditional love that is never withdrawn from any one of us. In all your embracing arms, draw us closer to you. Grant us a peace that passes all understanding, the peace of Christ to rule in our hearts, and joy in your presence, now and forevermore. Amen.
Thank you. At this time, Jerry Alonge from Vantage would like to have a few words and make opening remarks.
Hi, everybody. Vantage is great, really honored to sponsor this event, okay? And I've been in Meadville a long time. Some of you know me personally. Nothing is better than service, right? There's no more important avocation, and all of you as veterans and your families, you sometimes have a very difficult time, represent that service. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. If I can help you in any way, you give me a call. I mean that. 337-0000, that's our number. And though my staff and employees hate it when I do that, call, okay? We'll help you out. Now, I know you're tough, and I'm not going to say anything more because this is your day. Congratulations. Enjoy it. And isn't it cold out here?
Thank you. Yeah, it is cold out here. Let's all go inside now. We'll have breakfast. Everybody, this is going to be the Missing Man ceremony performed by the Veterans of the Vietnam War Post 52. It's a very solemn ceremony, and I'd appreciate everybody to be quiet and still. And just, I don't know your title. Bob Preston to do the ceremony.
Good morning, everyone. Everybody have their coffee? You ready? All right. I cheated. I had mine earlier this morning. I'd like to direct your attention to the small table up here on my left-hand side. If you can't see and you want to, we invite you to stand. The ceremony that we're going to do is to honor those that did not come home. I would like to explain the symbolism of the ceremony as the Vietnam Veterans of 52 do this. We present this table on many occasions, and so if you'll bear with us, we'll get started. Those who have served and those who are currently serving in the uniformed services of the United States of America are ever mindful that the sweetness of enduring peace has always been tainted by the bitterness of personal sacrifice. We are compelled to never forget that while we enjoy our daily pleasures, there are others who are endured and may still be enduring the agonies of pain, deprivation, and imprisonment. A reminder for us all to spare no effort to secure the release of any American prisoners from captivity and repatriation of the remains of those who died bravely in the defense of liberty, and demand a full accounting of those missing in action. We call them comrades. They are unable to be with their loved ones and the families, so we join together to pay humble tribute to them and to bear witness to their continued abuse. The table is small, symbolizing the helplessness of one prisoner, alone against his or her oppressors. The tablecloth is white, symbolic of the purity of their intentions to respond to their country's call to arms. Our comrades are missing from the United States Army. Our comrades are missing from the United States Navy. Our comrades are missing from the United States Air Force. Our comrades are missing from the United States Marine Corps. Our comrades are also missing from the United States Coast Guard. The single rose in the vase signifies the blood that they have shed in the sacrifice to ensure the freedom of our beloved United States of America. The rose also reminds us of the family and friends of our missing comrades who keep faith while awaiting their return. The red ribbon on the vase represents the red ribbons worn on the lapels of the thousands who demand with unyielding determination a proper accounting of our comrades who are not among us. A slice of lemon on the plate reminds us of their bitter fate. The salt sprinkled on the plate reminds us of the countless fallen tears of families as they wait. The glass is inverted. They cannot toast with us at this time. The Bible is placed prominently on the table. The Bible represents the strength gained through faith to sustain those lost from our country. The United States was found as one nation under God. The chair is empty. They are not here. The candle is reminiscent of the light of hope that lives in our hearts to illuminate their way home, away from their captors to the open arms of a grateful nation. The American flag reminds us that many of them may never return and have paid the supreme sacrifice to ensure our freedom. Let us pray to the Supreme Commander that all of our comrades will soon be back within our ranks. Let us remember and never forget their sacrifices. May God watch over them and protect them and their families, and may each of us live worthy of their sacrifices in the way that we love and serve. Thank you very much. This concludes our ceremony.
Thank you, Post 52. Okay, everybody, at this time, Colleen Munn of PA Stitches of Valor is going to present Quilts of Valor to different veterans.
Thank you, Cora. Sorry, I'm still a little short. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to take a few minutes. I know there's several veterans here because this is your day. But can I get the veterans to stand? And I'm going to have you do it by branch. So we're going to start with the Air Force. If you're in the Air Force, will you please stand? Thank you for your service. Any Army veterans here? Now look at ya. Thank you for your service. The United States Navy. I'm sorry, I'm kind of partial to that one. The United States Coast Guard. Thank you, sir. The United States Marines. Thank you, and happy birthday to you all. Well, as Cora said, my name is Colleen Munn. I'm with the group PA Stitches of Valor. We're the local chapter of the National Quilts of Valor Foundation. I would like to say thank you to your committee, Cora, for inviting us back again this year. Quilts of Valor was started in 2003 by a grassroots quilter, Catherine Roberts, when her son was deployed to Iraq. She saw the quilts as a way of comfort and healing to veterans battling their demons of war. Our mission is to present Quilts of Valor to service members and veterans who have been touched by war. She also states that a Quilt of Valor has the equivalence of a Purple Heart, only from a civilian. Since 2003, more than 200,000 quilts have been presented across the United States, Germany, Afghanistan, and Iraq. How did the local chapter get started? 2 years ago, I made my first 2 quilts of valor, one for my niece and one for her husband, upon their retirement from the Navy. After that, the National Quilts of Valor contacted me and said, we have nominations, and that's how you get a quilt, is to be nominated. Wow, nomination in your area, can you take care of that? And I said, oh, okay, I could do another quilt. The next week, I got another email from them saying, can you take care of another veteran in your area with a Quilt of Valor? That's 2 in 2 weeks. And I started getting nervous. I went to our quilt guild that meets out in Sagertown, and I talked to the president, and I said, what can we do? And she said, let's do it as a service project for the year 2017. And so that's how we got started. I helped her get it started. Since we started in April last year, we joined the National Foundation. In May, we had our first presentation of 2017. We have presented, the local chapter has presented 111 quilts to date in a little over a year and a half. After this weekend, it'll be up to 125. We have presented at small festivities. We've done them at larger presentations like this one. I am going to ask all the quilters to stand. They're all over there, so I'm going to ask you guys to come over behind your chairs. This is a few of us. I can't do it by myself, so these are my helpers. Okay, what is a quilt of valor? It is not a charity quilt or a blanket, Sandy. It's not a blanket.
Not a blanket, we're telling you.
He just told me he liked the blankets, and I had to correct him on him. The top of the quilt, in its many shapes, pieces, sizes, and colors, that makes the quilt top represents all of us here today, the individuals, communities, country coming together to show our support to our veterans. The batting or the filling of the quilt represents the hope the quilt will bring warmth, comfort, peace, and healing to the individual receiving it. The backing is the strength of the quilt. It represents the strength of the recipient, the support of family, friends, and community. The quilting, which is really hard to see on this quilt, the sample that we have, but it holds it all together. It represents the love, gratitude, and sometimes the tears of us makers. PA Stitchers of Valor gets together on a monthly basis to work on these quilts, to put them together. And at that time, we share stories of veterans that have been already received them, stories from veterans that are in our families, or our loved ones that are overseas serving right now, and that's where the tears come in. We share our reasons for being there, whether we have a spouse, mother, or father, a brother, or sister, or in-laws that were veterans, or like me, one of us, that we were doing the moving wall, and they had people that were relatives on the moving wall. So they have reasons also. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our honor today to award the following individuals with a Quilt of Valor on behalf of Quilts of Valor Foundation and the PA Stitchers of Valor. We ask each of you to come forward as Chief Master Retired John Amato calls your name. Please bring your spouse, if you have one, or a loved one with you to help with the presentation.
Good morning. Our first recipient is Corporal Terry Ray Howard. Terry enlisted in the Marine Corps in June of 1965 in Dunkirk, New York, and was sworn into the Corps in Buffalo, New York. He completed his boot camp training in Parris Island, South Carolina, and from there completed his infantry training in North Carolina. After graduating boot camp, Terry started his aircraft jet engine mechanic schooling in Millington, Tennessee. He completed his schooling with the military occupation specialty of 6412 jet engine gas turbine mechanic. He was assigned to Alameda, California Naval Air Station, where he practiced his aircraft mechanic trade. He worked on aircraft such as the A-4 Skyhawk and T-33. As a Marine, Terry received the following awards: Good Conduct Medal, Naval Defense,
and he reached expert level with the M14 rifle. During his time in the service, he volunteered as a military escort by assisting military families during the bereavement process and funeral services of their loved ones killed in the line of duty. Terry left active duty on July 29, 1969, and was honorably discharged in 1972 with the rank of corporal. After his discharge, Terry used his military training in aircraft mechanics to pursue and complete his associate degree at the Pittsburgh Institute of Aeronautics. He was married to Barbara Howard for 32 years, and they have 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. Tracy Servey, husband Michael, Corey Cozella, husband Michael, and 2 granddaughters, Bailey and Casey. Corporal Terry Ray Howard. Our next recipient is Private James Russell. James enlisted in the United States Army in 1957 at the age of 28. He was stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky. During his service, he worked with artillery and was discharged in 1958. James Russell. Next is Corporal Andrew Jack Hardenberg, Jr., enlisted in the Marine Corps on January 3, 1957. He served 3 years active duty and 3 years in the reserves. He was an aircraft hydraulics mechanic. He was part of the overhaul and repair division out of Cherry Point, North Carolina. Corporal Hardenberg was discharged on January 3, 1963. Corporal Andrew Jack Hardenberg, Jr. Sergeant Paul Pontillo. Sergeant Pontillo enlisted in the United States Army in 1944 during World War II. He was a tank driver and in a combat infantry division. After the war, he was regimental transportation sergeant for 2 years. He was discharged in 1947. He was awarded the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Infantry Badge for his service. Sergeant Paul Pontillo. Private First Class Glenn C. Hammond. Okay. I don't know if Paul's here.
Called in to come. There's Mr. Hammond.
Private Hammond enlisted in the United States Army September 9, 1942 during World War II. He was called into the Battle of Europe and served in 5 campaigns: Normandy, Loire Valley, Luxembourg, and Herdingen Forest, where he and fellow soldiers received the Bronze Star due to reaching their destination ahead of expected schedule. He was honorably discharged November 15th, 1945. Private First Class Glenn C. Hammond. Thank you, buddy.
Come here, Mr. Hammond. We're gonna let you sit on your own chair. How's that?
That'll be fun.
You're right here. No, right here, sir. We're gonna put you right here.
No, sit right here.
You're lucky. You're gonna be at a high rise.
Our next recipient is Master Sergeant Richard Bridge. Sergeant Bridge enlisted in the United States Army November 1958 during the Vietnam War. His basic training was at Fort Campbell, where he finished jump school. He was airborne throughout his service with the 101st Division and 82nd Division. He was Special Forces, including Delta Force, and his MOS was communications. He served in Germany, then Italy, where his youngest son was born, and returned to Fort Bragg until his retirement in 1982. He has master jump wings with over 100 and some jumps during his service career. Master Sergeant Richard Bridge. Sergeant Gerald D. Walton. Sergeant Walton enlisted November 1962 in the United States Marines. He was deployed to Vietnam in 1965 through March of 1966. He was a helicopter electrician, and he was discharged in November of 1966. Sergeant Walton said that He loves his country, and it was a privilege that he served. Sergeant Gerald D. Walton. Okay. Next recipient is Airman 3rd Class Benjamin F. Grant. Airman Grant enlisted in the Air Force in 1951 during the Korean War. He served as a medic and was discharged in 1953. He has 2 grandsons that have followed in his footsteps and several family members that have served in the military. Airman Grant drove for the VA for the past 18 years, taking fellow veterans to doctor appointments and hospitals as needed. Airman 3rd Class Benjamin F. Grant. Specialist 5th Class George McElhaney. Spec 5 McElhaney enlisted in the United States Army in 1966 during the Vietnam War. He was a medic serving with an engineer group in the Mekong Delta. He was discharged in 1968 and now has a heart condition, diabetes, and severe fungus in his feet from the jungle. They cannot rule out that he was exposed to Agent Orange. He also had malaria. Spec 5 George McElhaney. Master Sergeant Michael W. Lemke. Sergeant Lemke enlisted October 1970 in the United States Marines during the Vietnam War. He served until April 17, 1987, when he was medically discharged. He was in charge of mess hall and MP duties. Master Sergeant Michael W. Lemke. Technical Sergeant Clifford Millett. Sergeant Millett enlisted in the United States Air Force in June 1995 during the Persian Gulf War. He was in material management for 19 years and 10 months. He was deployed 6 times, 1998 to Germany, 2002 to Qatar and Turkey, 2005 to Iraq, and 2009 to Iraq, and 2019 to Qatar. He was discharged in June of 2015. His awards include the Air Force Commendation Medal, Air Force Achievement Medal, Unit Award with 1 Oak Leaf Cluster, Air Force Outstanding Unit Award, Organizational Excellence Award, Air Force Good Conduct Medal with 5 Oak Leaf Clusters, the National Defense Medal with 1 Service Star, and the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal. Technical Sergeant Clifford Millett. How about a big round of applause for our recipients.
As you can see, we have a couple empty spots. Paul hasn't been feeling good, so that's why he's probably not here. This veteran here was a surprise, and the surprise is on us. His wife is in Germany. They live in Hermitage area, and they are moving back to Germany, and she's already there. And so she told him he needed to be here, but evidently the weather or something scared him away. But so we never know if they're going to be here or not, but we just thank each one of you for service. Each quilt is not given like a book or a magazine, but with a hug. On one side of the quilt is one of the quilters from PA Quilts of Valor, representing all quilters across the U.S. On the other side is a family member and a close friend. Ladies, if you want to get your family member to help you and get it set up, if there's not a family member, there's extra quilters, and go ahead and present your quilts.
And one thing. Thank you.
Everybody have their pictures they need? Okay. The reason for this is so that when you are feeling alone, battling the demons of war, or just having a bad day, you can again wrap the quilt around yourself and feel the hug that you just received. And remember, you are not alone. You have the love, support, and gratitude of all of us, family, friends, quilters, community, and country. With each quilt comes a certificate. I'm going to ask Kathy to come up and deliver these. The certificate says, "The Quilts of Valor Foundation wishes to recognize you for your service to our nation. We consider it a privilege to honor you, though we may never know the extent of your sacrifice and service to protect and defend the United States of America. As an expression of our gratitude, we award you this Quilt of Valor." As of today, the story of the quilt becomes your story. We hope that you will keep this quilt with you as a tangible reminder that there are thousands of men and women across the country who are forever in your debt. Again, it has been an honor to be here today to present these Quilts of Valor. Thank you for having us. Thank you, veterans, for your service. And thank you, Cora, for your inviting us.
Can you take one for Pam? Hey, Pam. That's for Pam.
This is a good photo op if anybody wants pictures.
Thank you. I'm gonna get my water. I'm gonna grab mine. You got it?
They can have a seat.
Thank you, Colleen, and all of the quilters and the families. At this time, I'd like to remind everybody that after the speakers, we gather in groups by branch and have pictures taken, and then we will have the picture made up and sent to you. If you fill out the card with your name and address, you can get a picture, and then we hang them back in the hall. So that every year we do this to recognize the veterans that are here. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for coming out and thank everyone that's served in the military for their service. I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank my Veterans Committee that helps put this together and definitely works hard and brings us speakers. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Rich Crankota, and he'd like to say a few words.
Morning, my name's Rich. I work with Veteran Services in Crawford County with Tammy Jones and Diane Nottingham. We're in the downtown mall. When I asked Coral to give me a few minutes to talk, she said, well, when do you want to speak? I said, well, after you eat and before the last speaker, because I didn't want to be in between any of those things. So it's good to be here. First of all, happy birthday to you fellow Marines. No, that's actually, it's right? And a special happy birthday to a guy who, from what I understand, is full of hot air, Dick Hodgkiss. I just found out today that his birthday was on the same day as the Marine Corps birthday, and I think that he probably went through hell on Parris Island, right? Whenever you went through boot camp. So anyway, congratulations. Okay. All right. We have a few veterans in here. We're going to get him later. Okay, we got a few veterans in here. How many people know what a DD Form 214 is? All right. And how many of you have one of those? At least one. Okay, got it. DD 214, for those of you who don't know, is a document that is given to a veteran upon their discharge from service, from active duty. All right? That's a document that has a lot of information on it, from when they got into the service, how long they served, what their rank was, what their birthday was, where they served, awards, and their character of discharge. It's a very important document. I don't know about you guys and gals, but when I got out of the Marines in the early 70s, I was a young man, and I'll tell you what, that was the least thing on my mind was registering that thing at the courthouse. I had other things to do, all right? How wrong I was. It's very important that you get this document registered in the Recorder of Deeds office, Register and Recorder's office with Deb Curry, for a number of different reasons. Number one, if you ever want to file a claim with the Veterans Administration, the VA, we need that document. That's verifying your proof of service wherever you served. Okay, so that's very important. Number two, if you're going for a job and if there's a veteran's preference, you want to submit that to whomever you're applying to, for employment with. That's important. We're all going to die someday. Our county gives a stipend for burials. We need that document. And also, if you're going to do a government headstone, we need that document. It's not a time. It's not a time for us to be searching when you need it tomorrow. All right, because you're not going to get one tomorrow. It takes a long time. The National Personnel Records Center, they estimated about 3 weeks. We always say 3 weeks to 3 months to get that document. So, and here's the point. This has been a point of discussion amongst myself and my coworkers in the office, the commissioners, and actually people within the veterans, the County Veterans Officers, Service Officers Association in Pennsylvania. The new guys and gals that are becoming veterans that are leaving the service, they are told now not to register their DD-214s in the courthouse. They're talking about identity theft. Valid point, but here's what goes on. If and when you have that DD-214 registered in the recorder's office, if that veteran is still alive, he or she is the only person that can get that. And you got to show proof. You got to show ID. If you come down to our office and you ask for your DD-214, you're going to show proof of ID. We just don't give that out to anybody. Two, the veteran passes away, and hey, like I said before, we're all going to die sometime. If the veteran's spouse, there's an order of precedence. The veteran gets it first, the veteran's spouse gets it next. If the veteran's still alive and the spouse wants it, the veteran's got to write a letter, a little note. I authorize so-and-so to pick it up, and he or she's going to have proof of ID. Going down the list, if the veteran's passed away and the wife has passed away, the spouse has passed away, it goes to the next of kin, the child, if there's children in the family. We got to show, they got to show proof of ID to get that as well. My point in all this is, nobody's going to get that. Once it's up at the courthouse, nobody's going to get that document. If it's down in my office, nobody's going to get that document, unless it's the veteran, a spouse with permission from the veteran, or the child if the spouse and the veteran have passed. The only way that thing can leave my office, or I would say the Register and Recorder's office, if it's a court order. So rest assured that by registering your DD-214 at the courthouse, it's safe. Okay? Sorry to elaborate, but it's very important that you understand that document, there's a lot of personal identifiable information. I got it. I understand about the identity theft today. But rest assured, it's in good hands. Anybody have any questions? Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you got a question?
I do. Is this like born, if they were born in Crawford County?
No. If they reside in Crawford County, we have people that come and go. This is another thing. If a family member wants to do look up the family tree, that's something. Genealogy is a big thing. A lot of times they'll come to our office. We've got information on people that served in Crawford County from back in the Civil War. It's not as much as we have in today's day and age, obviously, but we do have information. If that veteran was born in Crawford County and they registered a DD-214 in Crawford County, it will be there. We've had veterans come in and ask for their DD-214. They think that no matter where they're from, we're going to have it in our office, and that's not the case. But to that point, if they were, let's say they lived in Westmoreland County, I could call the Veteran Service Officer down there and request a DD-214 to be sent. So, and I've sent it, I've been all over the United States asking for these things. Not too long ago, I asked for one from Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon. So it's all over the place. We have them. They're registered. If they're registered, we have access to them. And getting one in a day or two is better than getting one and waiting for it for possibly up to 3 months. And I say that because National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, they have about 20,000 of these requests every week. So, any other questions? Okay. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sandy Porter, and he'll be introducing our guest speakers today. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Glad that you're all here today. Before I get started, I'd like to have Vic Collier stand up, please. Stand up, Vic. It's not as easy as it was years ago.
That when you're as old as he is.
Okay, today is Vic's birthday. He's 89 years old. I'd like to give him a hand. Okay, today I'd like to introduce a friend and acquaintance of mine, Bob Bazylak. Many of you know him as Dr. Bazylak. How many patients here do we have of Dr. Bazylak's? A few. Okay. Okay. Dr. Bazylak was in the Air Force. He had the role of a flight surgeon, and he was involved. He's a colonel, and he's going to talk about the duties of a flight surgeon. He was in the Iraqi Freedom, so he's going to have an interesting discussion to talk about his duty and his experiences as a flight surgeon. He's wearing his coveralls today because he was working on his car in the parking lot, but and after the meeting here today, he'll be giving physicals in the back room. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Bazylak.
Thank you, Sandy. It's an honor to be here. I wrote some notes so I could not ramble and try to keep some semblance of some order here. I had gone through college and med school and lived through the Vietnam era where people were coming home and not being honored and being spat upon, and Hanoi Jane and all the poor reception for returning veterans and warriors with no hero welcomes, only contempt. My oldest brother had served 30 years in the military and also served in Vietnam, and I had two other brothers who had served in the military. There were 8 children in my family, and I had a scholarship through college and had gotten through medical school, and after being in practice for many years, felt I needed to do something for my country. I know that sounds sort of peachy, but I needed to do something, and I tried at first to get into the National Guard, and I had to fill out this form that said any injuries that you had. So I had a broken finger from football, I had this, I had that, and they said, well, you have to get a waiver for this, you have to get a waiver for that, you have to get a waiver for this. And I said, that's a bunch of crap, I thought. So then the Air Force said, well, you don't fill out those forms. You don't say you had a broken finger. You don't say you had that. So I said, hey, that's great. So I did that, and I filled out the form, and they said, well, you can come in. And I said, well, I want to fly. And they said, okay, you can fly. I said, I'd like to go to flight surgeon school. We can guarantee a flight surgeon school. I said, okay. And I understand they have this program called Top Knife.
if you get through flight surgeon school, you get to, and you get into top knife, you get to go and fly in an F-16. I said, well, I'd like to do that. So in 1995, I enlisted in the Air Force Reserve. I attended flight surgeon school, which was 12 weeks in Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. There we studied the different aspects of flight, physiology and stresses of pressure changes. We had to go through the altitude chamber, and if I wanted to fly in an F-16 or fast planes, I had to go through the centrifuge. So I did that twice, because the first time they said I had an arrhythmia, which when you go through 9 Gs, I found out later that everyone can have an arrhythmia. You have extra heartbeats when you're going through 9 Gs. So I did that twice. We had to practice the ejection seat and parachute landing. And we also had to go through survival training and also investigation of crash sites. I later was stationed at Youngstown Air Reserve Station, and there we did weekend training. Our number one priority was making sure all the pilots were ready to fly. And there, you know, you can't fly if you're on certain medications. You can't fly if you can't equalize pressure. You had to make sure their ears could equalize when they're going up and down in different pressures. And we also on weekends would do small arms training, and we would do chemical warfare training, survival training. And of course, when the air crews would go different places, I, being a flight surgeon, would make sure I would go to those places with them. I would go to Florida for water survival and learn how to, we would take off from an aircraft carrier in a parachute and go up in the air, and then would cut us free and we'd have to land and learn how to blow up the raft and make sure we would learn to do that. I also was, had the opportunity to go to Cape Kennedy to learn how to rescue astronauts if there was an aborted launch. I never got to fulfill, I had to do a second part of that, which was to go to Washington State, and before I was able to do that, I got activated to go to Kuwait. But part of the air duties at Youngstown would be to transport equipment and troops to different parts of the country at that time. And they would do that on weekends. Like one weekend we would transport equipment to Washington State, or we would take equipment down to Florida and different parts of the country. And oftentimes we do weekend training flights. Like you would see the C-130s flying over Meadville many times, or they would go, we would go over New York State and we would do low-level flights up over the Allegheny Valley, and it would be just to do training. Many people don't know they have a unit that's a spray unit. If there are floods in different parts of the country, they have a mosquito problem or bug problem. And Youngstown is one of the few areas that has a spray mission. They have certain planes that go and spray chemicals to combat the bug problem. Some of my deployments where I had to go to really tough places like the islands, the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Germany. I did go to Bosnia once, but the worst part was going to Kuwait, and I did make, I think, 20 combat flights. I was in Baghdad 10 times. The biggest, I think, problem I had was bringing back the bodies and the body parts from different areas of Iraq. On the way over from Youngstown, we stopped in the Azores. My duty was to make sure after people got their anthrax injections that people were not having reactions to the anthrax injections. And I spent 4 days there. It was a different time. Many people over there. The base was called Ali Al Salim, and they called it the Rock. It was mainly desert. The base was on a rock outlet, and you could see different places there where the people had been lined up after the Iraqis invaded and shot people, and there were bullet holes still in the buildings there. We had to wear reflective, like patrol boys or crossing guards every night to make sure that everyone knew where we were all the time. My duties on the base were just to be like they were in Youngstown, to do physicals and make sure everyone was safe, and to do emergencies. If there was an in-flight emergency coming into the base, I had to go to the flight line. And the first time that I was called in the middle of the night, I was not certain as to exactly what the procedure was to get on the flight line, and I was sort of arrested by the MPs because I didn't do it the proper way, and that was a little learning experience. But outside the base, when we were landing, you could see there were certain areas where they had camel races. Another time we were landing at night, and it looked like it was the Crawford County Fair. There were tents and neon lights, and there were Mercedes parked around, and they were Bedouins. That's the way they traveled. And the next day, the tents were gone and the cars were gone. They traveled that quickly and moved around that quickly. And we got to get to Kuwait City 1 or 2 times, and you would see abandoned cars along the streets, and from what I was told, the government just bought them new cars. If their cars broke down, the government bought them new cars. And it was a very wealthy city. There were Ferraris and Mercedes all over the place. And it was a very wealthy place. Every time we returned to the base, though, we had to check under the car and make sure there were no IEDs placed. And when we returned to the base, there was a place where the sentries would walk underneath the cars, would use mirrors underneath the cars and check. And coming back, we had some wonderful times. Wonderful times. A few of the places we went, when the first time we went, we would, I think we went to Balad. We were landing, and the pilot would point out to me that every half mile on the runway you could see new concrete that was poured, because when they first invaded, they would blow up the runways so the Iraqi jets could not take off, and you would see where they had to replace the runways so we could land there. They had to repair the runways there. And in certain areas also you could see where there were drones where they had them placed. And it was, one time we were ready to take off, but we had to wait 25 minutes so a drone could land. Another time we were landing in Balad, and we found out that there was the ancient city of Ur was there, and that was the birthplace of Abraham. So I called ahead and asked a captain if we could visit the place, and we got to visit. It's called a ziggurat, which was like a pyramid where they buried people, and we all got to stand in the birthplace of Abraham, and I thought that was neat. And it was the birthplace of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And we got to take pictures, and we found out later someone was trying to steal, a Japanese, I guess, pilot or one of his crew was trying to steal some stones from there and got arrested. But when we took off from there, well, not when we took off, when we landed and we're going there in a car, we came to a crossroad and it said to the left and chemical weapon plant to the right. It was sort of strange to see that. But other times when we got home, it was sort of strange because everyone was had difficulties getting adjusted to the different types of procedures that were going on at home, because there was no alcohol allowed in Kuwait or Iraq. I went to Mass one time at the embassy in Kuwait, and everyone thought we could get a drink there, but you couldn't. But we, on the way home, we stopped in Scotland for fuel, and it was the first time we saw grass in 4 months, and it was nice to see grass there. But when we came back, we made different trips, and I have just one anecdotal story. When we would take trips, like I said, we went to the Mediterranean and we went to the islands. We had to Puerto Rico, we had to do flyovers for Guantanamo Bay. We were supposed to stop there, but the weather was bad. But every time we would go away for a weekend trip, I would take a medical bag with me for medication, because didn't know when one of the flight crew would get sick. But I would always take something for the, if we'd go out in the evening, we'd have to have a tip for the cab drivers. And I would always take samples of Viagra to tip the cab drivers. So the pilots would always ask how many babies I was responsible for with my Viagra over the world, and I never knew how many there were, but it was quite funny. But who knows? And I had injured my neck over in Kuwait, and when we came back, after a year, I was no longer permitted in the Air Force, and I miss it. I see the guys, and I talk to them frequently. When the Thunderbirds are over at Youngstown Air Base, I go over there and I see them, and I talk to them frequently. I talked to John Amato when I did school physicals at Conneaut Lake. When he was there working, I would see him, and we talk about when you come back here, it's different because you miss. It's strange when you come back because it's a different type. You don't know how to adapt at first when you come back. I was only over in the war zone once, and he was over several times, and it's difficult to adjust. I wasn't exposed to as much as a lot of you people are, and it's a shame that these young people nowadays don't know what you have been through. I have not been through anything compared to you, and I thank you for what you've done. I thank my wife and son for putting up with me. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexis Hart. I am the Director of Writing at Allegheny College and a Navy veteran. So thank you to Keith for writing that wonderful introduction to me in your program. You can read that, but just briefly, I am from a long tradition of military service and academics. My great-grandfather was in the Army, and he was the historian for the Iowa State Teachers College. My grandfather was in the Army, and he taught at Shriners College in Texas. My father was in the Navy, like me, and he was a professor at the Oregon Institute of Technology. So I like to joke, my father is Irving H. Hart III. So my great-grandfather is Irving Hart, my grandfather is Irving Hart Jr., my father, Irving Hart III. I'm not Irving Hart IV, and neither is my brother, funnily enough. But I'm very, very proud of both my military service and my academic work. And I want to thank one of my advisees, who's also a member of Allegheny Veterans Services. We have a student group on campus that works out at Lilac Springs, and they'd be really eager to get connected with other veterans. So thank you, Lena, for being here. And my family's here somewhere. I think they found a seat. My husband and my 2 daughters are here. So I commissioned through the Navy ROTC at the University of Rochester. I commissioned in 1993, which was when the service was downsizing. And so usually, if you know anything about ROTC, they commission line officers, so ship drivers and submarine drivers and pilots and NFOs. But I actually commissioned in the staff corps. So I was a supply corps officer. I went from my Navy ROTC training because, again, it was downsizing. A lot of people were getting stashed or taking a little bit of a leave before starting their service. So my first job in the Navy actually was teaching technical writing to middle schoolers in a volunteer program in Texas. So I've gotten to combine my love of teaching with my love of the military from the beginning. I went to the Supply Corps School in Athens, Georgia to do my training, and that was right after they allowed women on combatant ships. So I went to the USS Essex, a big deck amphib out in San Diego. I was the only woman on my ship for 3 months and one of 3 women for my first 6-month deployment. So as Keith's article says, men are wonderful people, but they're not other women, so it got a little bit lonely. But when I wanted to start by thanking the Through a Veterans Eye Planning Committee, particularly Agnes, who called me and said, "Alexis, I need a favor. We got a speaker who dropped out. Can you help us out?" So I'm really a second choice, but that's okay. I also want to thank Dr. Mariana Grahowski. She's the co-author of the chapter from which most of these remarks are excerpted, and it's forthcoming in an edited collection from the University of South Carolina Press titled Remembering Women, and is edited by Lene and Helen Gaillet. So now, a brief history. Upon the establishment of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps in 1901, women officially began serving in the United States military, even though they had willingly served in unofficial capacities or even disguised as men in every conflict beginning with the Revolutionary War. Today's all-volunteer force boasts the greatest percentage of women in uniform since the end of World War II. However, despite their steadfast service, women's contributions to the country's defense efforts have often been downplayed with modifiers such as temporary, auxiliary, non-combatant, or simply described as freeing the men to fight. As a result, the public, servicemen, and even women who serve are often conditioned by this language to consider military women as ancillary to the real military, long understood to be staffed by the warfighters, typically portrayed as men, the fabled bands of brothers who preserve the country's freedoms through their sacrifices on the battlefield. World War I was the first major conflict for which U.S. military recruited women in significant numbers, albeit rather reluctantly. Personnel shortages compelled the military to expand job opportunities for women, though only in temporary stopgap status. During the course of the war, more than 30,000 American women served as nurses, clerical workers, and telephone operators. But following the war, all of the women, excepting the nurses, were swiftly discharged, reinforcing their temporary military status as necessary only to free a man to fight. Furthermore, the initial World War Adjustment Compensation Act, which provided bonuses to veterans based on the length and location of service, excluded women due to the insertion of the word male before the word veteran. Although the act was later amended to define veteran as any individual who was a member of the military or naval forces, most Americans, including most women who had served in the armed forces, only accorded the honorific term veteran to men, particularly men who had served in combat. This stereotype persists today, due in part to the historical pattern of the U.S. military employing women only temporarily only in times of need, and only in quasi-military or civilian status. Indeed, the women who served in World War I were themselves influenced by recruitment posters and society's expectation that they would serve only as long as the war necessitated it. Therefore, they tended to characterize their work as merely helping the men and not of any value in and of itself. In a 2002 interview for the Veterans History Project, for example, World War I Army Nurse Corps Captain Alice L. Duffield downplayed the importance of her contributions. "The boys trained. We didn't do anything except work. When you're in the military, you're in the military." And I didn't know that. I didn't think it was important. When the armistice was over, been signed, I wanted to go home. And so I left, went home, and I was perfectly satisfied. I was engaged to be married. By allowing themselves to be perfectly satisfied with the option of marriage and domesticity over a career in the service, women like Duffield inadvertently contributed to the inequitable conditions not only for themselves, but also for the women who followed them into military service. Furthermore, because of its low cultural value, women's military service was subsequently absent from historical records, and women veterans often didn't share their stories because, like Duffield, they assumed they weren't important, that their contributions were just mundane work, not praiseworthy like combat. When the U.S. became fully involved in World War II, military commanders once more faced severe manpower shortages, and, as in World War I, they called on women to release the men to fight. While more than 350,000 women served during World War II, the military leadership and the general public continued to regard women's service as temporary, as an exception born of emergency need. Toni Arkell, a Marine cryptographer, reflects this attitude in her description of her World War II service. "Well, there weren't too many women Marines when I joined, but I didn't feel like I was all that important. I was assigned to classified records. We handled anything from confidential on up to top secret. And there were 2 women in my office, and the rest were men, and we were next door to the general. I felt like I was doing my part. I really did. We relieved a lot of men to go." Despite the technical nature of her cryptography and her top secret clearance, Arkell, like Duffield, characterizes her work as less important than the combat missions of the men she relieved. The American press also downplayed women's military service. For example, at the Women Corps Directors' first press conference, reporters focused on either the trivial or the sensational: underwear, makeup, whether women would salute, whether enlisted women could date male officers, and vice versa. The mainstream media also ran stories on the petticoat army and Fort Lipstick that resulted in serious misconceptions of the highly skilled services women provided, including as test pilots, flight instructors, chemical engineers, mechanics, code breakers, and cryptographers like Arkell. Despite these unfair representations, women continued to enlist and to serve proudly. For example, Marine Corps reservist Marion Krugman recalls, "Once the Marines were accepting women, I knew that's where I wanted to go. There was no question in my mind, because it was the best. I mean, for one, it was the hardest to get into for women. Part of it is, like my father, I want to be where the action is, and I felt sort of a family obligation to do my part." Despite their willingness to do their part, most women were summarily discharged upon cessation of armed conflict, just as their predecessors in World War I had been. After their discharges, few maintained their connections to the military, received public acknowledgments, or accrued any tangible benefits from their veteran status. Not only were Veterans Administration officials either unsympathetic to the needs of female veterans or unaware that women were entitled to the same benefits as male veterans, but unlike the men who were overwhelmingly greeted as heroes after the war, most women discovered that their service was not universally applauded and was in fact often derided. Consequently, many women veterans concluded that the less said about their military service, the better. Along with their self-imposed silence, many female veterans essentially disappeared from public records because their individual footprints were wiped out when they became Mrs. John Jones. In 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act officially removed the stigma of temporary status for service women, but kept the distinction between male and female personnel by maintaining separate reporting and support structures. Women officers were also precluded from having command authority over men and advancing past a certain rank. In the decades following the passage of the Integration Act, the continued prominence of separate and unequal status was readily apparent in military training. Female recruits were taught nothing about firing weapons or living in the field, but were instead taught how to apply makeup properly and what shades of lipstick and nail polish would best blend with their uniforms. Wendy P. Gellert, a member of the Waves, recalled this aspect of her training in the 1960s. Back in the 60s, the Waves were separate from the men, so there was all the recruits were treated like little ladies, and everything was ladies this and ladies that. I'd never worn makeup or anything in my life. I had to learn how to wear lipstick. Though the Integration Act ostensibly provided service women with equal pay and benefits, the continued categorization of women as non-combatants in an organization whose central function is armed combat, combined with the emphasis on women's femininity, their presumed need for male protection, and the injunction against women having command authority, that is, having authority over men, constrained women's professional options, limited their advancement, and kept them in a subordinate status relative to their male counterparts. Given such constraints, perhaps it's not surprising that relatively few women served on active duty during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. It's a big dip. Most of the women who did serve were medical or clerical personnel. While it is true that male Vietnam veterans did not often receive warm welcomes upon their return, Major General Gene Holm, U.S. Air Force retired, recounts that women who made it safely home after serving in Vietnam felt even more compelled to hide their experiences due to society's incomprehension of why any woman volunteered to serve in the military, much less go to Vietnam. After the Vietnam War, the political fallout brought an end to military conscription in the United States. The shift to an all-volunteer force followed the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and resultant changes in personal and professional opportunities for women. The later 1970s ushered in the admission of women to the federal service academies, the inactivation of the separate women's service corps, and the gradual opening of assignments in aviation and sea duty for women. Throughout the 1980s, opportunities for women continued to expand, and when the first Gulf War broke out in 1990, the number of women in the military had grown exponentially to 7.2% of the forces deployed in support. Not only did women encounter the risks of combat during Operations Desert Storm and Desert Shield, some women made the ultimate sacrifice. It was during this time that the American public began to realize that women had become an integral and significant part of the military, serving side by side with the men in the field, doing the tough, dirty, risky jobs of war. Indeed, public awareness and official military acknowledgement of women's vital role in the success of combat operations eventually resulted in Congress's decision to lift the restrictions on women serving on combat ships and flying in combat aircraft, though retaining restrictions on ground combat. After Desert Storm, a more conscious effort was made to recognize the veteran status of women as well. For example, the Veterans Care Act, which offered a variety of gender-specific services and programs to care for women veterans, was initiated in 1992. The following year, the Vietnam Women's Memorial opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. In 1994, the Veterans Improvement Act set into law the establishment of a Center for Women Veterans. Both the Women's Veterans Health Program Office and the Women in Military Service for America Memorial were opened in 1997. As we well know, early in the 21st century, the U.S. military found itself once again engaged in combat operations overseas, landing troops in Afghanistan in November 2001 and declaring war on Iraq in March 2003. As for women's involvement in the global war on terror, more than 250,000 women have deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. More than 100 women have died fighting overseas, and more than 1,000 have been wounded. Army Sergeant Connie Rose Spinks was one of those women who was wounded. The accident occurred when we were heading back to camp. Before I even had a chance to pull the trigger, he was already there. He had run into my vehicle, and that's when it exploded. I was ejected from the turret. I had a lot of injuries. When they say women should not be in combat, honestly, the women are already in combat. They don't have to be on the front lines because there are no front lines. If you go out, anywhere that you go to, you have the opportunity to be attacked. Take, for example, the female engagement teams. All women teams assembled to perform duties their male counterparts cannot due to cultural norms. For example, searching Iraqi and Afghani civilian women and girls. These teams have proven invaluable to the war efforts in an era in which enemy combatants do not wear identifiable uniforms, and combat operations are not confined to clearly demarcated battlefields, but are characterized by urban combat within and among citizens' homes and businesses. In 2013, the Pentagon officially lifted the ground combat ban, and by 2016, 11,000 combat positions open to women, including billets on submarines. I hope this brief history has demonstrated the worthwhile contributions that women have been making in our armed forces since our country's founding. As I've argued, it's a history that is often overlooked or downplayed, which has resulted in misconceptions about women's military service and has also led many women to fail to self-identify as veterans upon their departure from service. As Navy veteran Jennifer Marshall recently stated in an interview with military.com, "This year, I want to walk into one of those fine places that offers a free meal to vets and actually have someone not be surprised when I tell them, I am a veteran too. I'd like to go to the Veterans Day Parade in my Navy shirt and not be asked when my husband served. I just want to be perceived in the same light as the men I served alongside." That is my hope for all the women who have served. Yes, we did do more than simply free a man to fight. And yes, we are veterans too. Will all the female veterans please stand? If you're interested in learning more about women's veterans' experiences, I encourage you to go online to browse the Women at War archive at the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project site and the Betty H. Carter Women's Veterans Historical Project site maintained by the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I also encourage you to visit the Women's Memorial the next time you're in the DC area. Thank you. Yeah, do you have questions?
No, I have a comment. Thank you for your naval service, Doctor. But I want to point out that a few years ago, our president ordered a surgical missile strike on Syria. It was carried out with great proficiency. I believe the vessel was a guided missile frigate, and the commanding officer was a war.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer questions. We got a little bit of time. Yes, sir.
Do you have a husband?
Did I have a heart attack?
No, do you have a husband?
Oh, I do have a husband. I met him after I was out of the service, though. He's not a vet, no, sir. He is an academic, though.
He's a nice guy, Paul.
Excuse me, sir?
He's a nice guy, Paul.
He's the best person I know. I'm super fortunate to have. I married well. I will say that. I did. Where is my husband? There he is. That guy right there.
Abraham.
Yes, sir.
My wife is also a veteran.
Yes, sir.
She served in the Army.
Wonderful.
She was over in France for 2 years.
Yes, well, thank please tell her thank you. And I want to echo the comment that was, tell me, Dr. Bass said about the families serving too, right? You saw here with the presentation of the Quilts of Valor, the families are so, so important to our veterans. So thank you to the families. Thank you.